Good day. Today is Monday, 27th January 2025, and I'm going to begin this program with news of an astonishing admission made in Kiev by none other, apparently, than Kirill Budanov, Ukraine's military intelligence chief. Now, we haven't actually been hearing that much from Budanov for some time, but apparently there was a top-level meeting of senior Ukrainian officials and parliamentarians in Kiev. They were looking at the situation of Ukraine in the war, and they were also discussing the possible tactics that Ukraine might follow over the course of the negotiations between the Trump administration and Russia, which might be shaping over the horizon. Anyway, over the course of this meeting, this discussion, Budanov was asked to express his views, and he apparently stunned everyone by saying that Ukraine has about 6 months left. If there is no peace within 6 months, then after 6 months, if the war continues, it will be the end, in effect, of Ukraine. Now, apparently, this was then received by the entire room in a kind of stunned silence. Apparently, Budanov spoke very calmly in a matter-of-fact voice. I don't know whether there was any pushback from anyone else present in the meeting. We've had statements since this meeting took place from Zelensky's chief of staff, Andrei Yermak. Yermak says that for the moment, Ukraine is not receiving any demands for negotiations or proposed peace agreements or anything of that kind. We'll come to all of that in a moment. But it could be that that was an attempt in some way to downplay the significance of what Budanov said. But it completely flies in the face of all of the rhetoric we have been hearing from the Ukrainians ever since the conflict began. And by the way, from Budanov himself, that the war is being fought by Ukraine, that Ukraine is fighting successfully, that it is able to continue to resist the Russians, that at times Ukraine appears to be winning. The Russians are on the brink of running out of missiles. The Russians are on the brink of running out of artillery ammunition. The Russians, their economy is on the brink of collapse. Their manpower is becoming disastrously depleted. We've had these stories repeat themselves endlessly. As I said, Budanov has played a significant role in floating these stories, and suddenly, out of nowhere, during a meeting, Budanov comes along and drops the bombshell that, in fact, Ukraine may have no more than 6 months. Beyond 6 months, it's curtains. Now, one wonders a little about what is going on. I think Budanov is probably telling the truth as he knows it. I'm sure that he's getting the same information that I'm getting, and an awful lot more as well. He probably knows a little bit about the state of casualties of the Ukrainian army, the realities of the mobilization, which apparently are not going very well at all. He probably knows that weapons deliveries from the West peaked some time ago, that already 2024 showed a sharp reduction in weapons supplies from the West, and with the arrival of Donald Trump, less still is coming. He probably is aware also that the Russian army, contrary to all claims and assertions, is continuing to increase in size. Now, Dmitry Medvedev, the deputy chair of the Russian Security Council and the head of Russia's Military Industrial Commission. He announced about 2 days ago that over the course of 2024, I think he said that something like 420,000 men had joined the Russian army. It might have been a bit more, it might have been a bit less. I don't, off the top of my head, remember the exact number. Now, of these 420,000 men, 70,000 volunteered specifically to fight in the special military operation. The others, mostly apparently men in their 20s, were enlisting into the Russian armed forces generally. So it's a mistake to think that all of these people will be sent to fight in Ukraine. They might be sent to deployments in the Far East, in the Arctic, in Kaliningrad, in all sorts of other places. And of course, many of them, anyway, will be undergoing training. But the key thing is that the Russian army continues to grow bigger. It's becoming bigger all the time. Its resources are increasing, even as Ukraine's resources are depleting. I read an article recently, I think it was in the New York Times, I'm sure it was in the American media, which put a guesstimate of the size of the Russian army in Ukraine at 450,000 men active in combat, and the Ukrainian force at about 250,000 men. Now, Ukrainian figures have tended to put the Russian army much bigger. I'm not going to engage myself in further guesswork about this. But regardless, the Russian army is growing in size. The American media is reporting that it outnumbers the Ukrainians, and by a significant total. The facts on the battlefields, the fact that the Russians are now able to engage in complex maneuvers, all of that strongly supports that claim. And the Ukrainians themselves are losing strength. Their army is becoming overstretched and overextended. Their infantry, according to complaints that one reads on Ukrainian social media, is now in a desperate state, that there are not enough Ukrainian soldiers still in the infantry. We get reports about how technicians from the air defense system and from other logistic and supply departments of the Ukrainian army are having to be conscripted to fight, because that's the only way that the holes can be plugged. And there are reports that over the next couple of days, a bill will be presented to the Rada whereby Zelensky does the West's bidding and brings the conscription age down to 18. And there are, again, reports that this will be passed, even though it is bitterly controversial and unpopular in Ukrainian society. And there are some claims that the mobilization drive that will then be launched on the back of this decision to lower the conscription age will produce perhaps another 300,000 men to fight for Ukraine. Now, that might be an optimistic estimate based on the previous conscription, which was ordered in April. By every admission now that we get across Ukraine, that mobilization of men of 25 and upwards failed to produce anywhere close to the numbers of men that Ukraine needed to continue the battle. And there's been this endless, cynical drumbeat from Western officials, from American officials, both of the Biden and of the Trump administration, calling on Ukraine to lower the conscription age to 18. Ben Wallace, writing in the Daily Telegraph, called for it. So it looks as if the Ukrainians, facing these enormous gaps on their front lines, desperately short of infantry, apparently threatened by some of their allies, perhaps the Americans as well, that unless they lower the conscription age and increase the manpower pool, then weapons supplies will dwindle. It seems that they're about to do that and that they're about to lower the conscription age. But Budanov will know that doing that in itself is an admission of a deeper crisis. That if Ukraine has to take this fatal step, this ominous step of having to lower the conscription age in that way, of recruiting teenagers into the Ukrainian army, it is because losses on the battlefields have become so great that they can no longer be replaced anymore, that the gaps in the army are becoming unsustainable, that the infantry is becoming exhausted, and that Ukraine is being attritioned out of existence. So he will also know that recruiting 18, 19, 20-year-olds is not going to reverse or change this trend, that there's going to be insufficient time to train these despondent and unwilling and very frightened young people to fight the Russians. The Russian army, which is not only growing in size, is becoming better all the time. It now has a large number of highly professional junior and middle-ranking officers and NCOs which command it. Much of the infantry has become extremely experienced about how to conduct operations. It's become a deeply professional, highly trained army. The training system apparently in Russia has been massively updated since the start of the war, drawing on the experience of the war itself. So an untrained mass of young men is going to be thrown into the battle to fight an army that has now become professional to a level that arguably no other army in the world currently is. And Budanov must know that this will be a disaster, that this will compound the disaster that is already playing out on the Ukrainian battlefields. Well, it could be that that Budanov knows all of this, that he has some knowledge still also of Russian production rates. The information he has given about Russian war production at earlier stages in the war has been, by the way, almost uniformly wrong, but perhaps he's revised his figures on this, and perhaps he's aware of the absolutely disastrous state of the Ukrainian economy, about how pretense that war production continues in Ukraine to anything like the scale needed to sustain the war effort is a fiction as well. Presumably he knows all of that. So maybe this is what made him come and make that admission in Kiev. Now, as I understand it, this has not been widely publicized in Ukraine itself, though it has been publicized sufficiently in social media that it's been widely commented upon there. So I don't know whether the general population in Ukraine is aware that their own intelligence chief is advising that their country has only 6 months left, and that unless there is a peace agreement within that time, it's curtains for Ukraine. But I can't help but think that despite optimistic spin by Zelensky and Yermak, and from time to time General Syrski, despite all of the attempts by Western journalists from time to time also to build up the story about Ukraine and its supposed successes in the war, I can't help but think that this revelation from Budanov will gradually spread. People in Ukraine will become increasingly aware of it, and it will inform their views and their decisions and how they themselves continue to respond to the war. As for Budanov himself, I have to say that I do wonder whether this admission puts him on the same trajectory as that of Zelensky's former spin doctor, Alexander Arestovich. Arestovich, in 2022, was an enthusiastic supporter of the war, spreading all kinds of claims about how Ukraine was going from victory to victory. And for the record, at the time, I thought and said that I thought he did it very well. But he was too intelligent a man in the end to keep repeating this fantasy. And at some point, he and Zelensky fell out with each other. And increasingly, Arestovich, who is, my understanding, is that he's now in the United States. Anyway, he has become increasingly critical of Zelensky and of the entire Ukrainian war effort, and has been giving interviews and analysis, some of which is very interesting, by the way, in which he takes a diametrically opposite view of the war to that which his former friend Zelensky continues to do. And I wonder whether Budanov is headed in the same path. There's been lots of rumours over the last couple of months, that Zelensky and Yermak are looking for ways to sack Budanov. They see him as a rogue cannon, a loose cannon. Given that he's coming out making these sort of statements, perhaps that's not surprising. Perhaps that the fact that he has finally come out and made that statement is a sign that he does expect to be sacked sometime soon. Maybe when he is sacked, he will finally start being more straightforward and open and honest about Ukraine's situation in the war. Maybe he will go to the United States and team up with Arestovich, and the two of them will start doing programs together. Just saying. It'd be an interesting duo if that happens. Anyway, we will see. But this is a shock revelation. I wonder whether before long we will get the denials. Just saying. Denials that Budanov said any such thing. But many hours have passed since I first read about it, and I've seen no denials up to now, and I am confident that he did indeed say it. It's a shock revelation, and it tells us how very bad the situation in military terms for Ukraine has now become. Well, all of this is happening at one and the same time that Strana, one of Ukraine's best websites, except that I understand it isn't published in Ukraine anymore. The people who run Strana, Ukrainian patriots to a man and woman, just saying, apparently have been obliged to run Strana from outside Ukraine, and many of them are potential targets for arrest if they ever were to go to Ukraine. Anyway, Strana has now published an article in which they make some very interesting claims. They say that a document was recently passed by the Americans to the Europeans outlining the timeline that the Americans are planning to follow over the next couple of weeks, next 100 days, leading to some kind of a peace agreement by the 9th of May. And that this timeline, this document containing this timeline, was then passed on by the Europeans, and we're not told by which Europeans, to the Ukrainians themselves. And we're not told, at least I don't understand, how the Ukrainians are supposed to have responded to this. But the timeline, this document is quite interesting. Now, before I discuss it, can I just say that, of course, I'd have no idea whether it is real. The original document, obviously, I have not seen. I am actually very skeptical that it is real, that it has actually originated from the Trump administration. I would have thought that if it had done so, there would have been some leak about its existence in the American media and the European media by now. And the fact that the first revelation of its existence has come from Strana, to my mind, casts a question mark over it. But anyway, it outlines a process whereby Putin and Trump and Zelensky have discussions, telephone calls. At some point towards the end of this month or at the beginning of February, there's some kind of meeting or series of meetings, perhaps involving all three, that is supposed to take place in March. Then there is supposed to be a ceasefire agreed in the middle of April, followed by the setting up of an international conference, which will include China and other countries, many of them from the global south, and which both Russia and Ukraine will attend. And by the 9th of May, which is of course Victory Day in Russia, there is supposed to be a full final peace agreement. And this timeline apparently sets out what the broad contours of that peace agreement would be. Briefly, Ukraine would give up its quest to join NATO. It would change its constitution and would incorporate in the constitution a commitment that Ukraine does not join NATO. There would be a meeting of the NATO Council which would ratify that decision and which would confirm that NATO itself is not aspiring any longer for Ukraine to join NATO and accepts Ukraine as a NATO country. The agreement then apparently sets out certain provisions about territory. The Russians basically would be left in control of the territory they currently occupy. Ukraine would confirm that it was not seeking its return, at least by force, but it would not be required to accept that this territory is indeed Russian and is incorporated in Russia. Ukraine would also undertake certain commitments to lift restrictions on the Russian language, on Russian or on political parties which want to seek a rapprochement with Russia, the ongoing persecution of the Orthodox Church in Ukraine would end. There would be elections in Ukraine in August for a new presidency, and Ukraine would move forward with its EU membership application, which the expectation is would be fulfilled by 2030. The Europeans would agree that Ukraine becomes a full member of NATO by that date. And lastly, the question of Ukraine's military would be decided, in effect, in Ukraine's favor. Ukraine would be able to maintain as big a military as it wished, and the United States would retain total freedom to continue to arm it. So that's supposedly the ultimate objective of this process. I was unable to see much in the way of reference to security guarantees. The United States apparently would not be expected to give any. It would not participate in Ukrainian reconstruction. And as for peacekeepers, European peacekeepers, that would be decided in a separate negotiation, though it's not clear between whom precisely. Now, I don't myself think that this does originate from the Trump administration. I have been listening and reading to the various comments the Trump administration officials have been making over the last couple of days, and indeed weeks before it became the Trump administration. And I don't think they have a plan as fully thought out as this one. I wonder whether this article in Strana and Budanov's revelation are connected to each other. Whether what we get in this article is not so much Donald Trump's strategy towards securing a peace agreement that would end the war and preserve Ukraine, but whether perhaps this is a peace plan being floated within Ukraine by Budanov and by others close to him, and that it's been thrown out there via Strana in the hope that the Trump people will bite upon it. Now, I say that because here we have Budanov saying that there has to be a peace agreement within 6 months, and if there isn't a peace agreement within 6 months, then it's curtains for Ukraine. And is it perhaps just coincidence that a Ukrainian publication, admittedly a dissident one, should come up with a proposal for a peace agreement at roughly the same time that Budanov is talking about a peace agreement as well? I just throw this out. There's an awful lot of uncertainties and confusions about this. Now, let's assume that this is somebody's plan for peace, be it American, be it Ukrainian. Would it fly? The first thing to say is that it does actually go a certain distance, in fact, a significant distance towards Putin's 2024 proposals. First of all, it concedes that Ukraine cannot be in NATO. Putin has said that is a red line. Donald Trump has said that is a red line, and he appears to accept that. So Trump appears to accept the Russian red line. This peace agreement at least attempts to address the situation. It too says that Ukraine cannot be a member of NATO, that whether the Russians would accept the formula that it sets out is a completely different matter. Secondly, obviously, it accepts that the Russians will retain control of the territory they occupy. But note that this does not extend to the four regions, the full territory of the four regions, only the territory they currently occupy. And it does not amount to recognition of this territory as Russian. But then maybe the June 2024 proposals from the Russians didn't demand that. They didn't demand that Ukraine actually recognize that territory as Russian, merely that it withdraw and cede it. Just so. It also does finally accept that there has to be some retreat, at least nominally, from the hardline position, in fact the extreme position, that the Ukrainian authorities have been taking basically ever since the Maidan events of 2014, the seizure of power in February 2014, that Ukraine must transfer to a monocultural, ideologically coherent single unit. This is something that the British historian Richard Sakwa, by the way, has written about very interestingly. It accepts that there will have to be a place for the speaking of Russian in Ukraine and for the Orthodox Church. So Putin and his people, seeing this document, would probably come away and say to themselves, well, this is progress. But they're almost certainly also going to come back and say that, yes, this is progress, but it doesn't go anywhere far enough. First of all, let's look at the provisions about NATO. Ukraine is supposed to change its constitution back to say that NATO membership has been abandoned and that Ukraine will remain a neutral state. Ukraine became independent with a constitution which also said that Ukraine would remain neutral and would not seek NATO membership. Ukraine changed its constitution to seek NATO membership. What stops that from happening all over again? Because Ukraine changes its constitution to say one thing doesn't mean, based on what has happened, that Ukraine cannot change its constitution back again in the opposite direction. The Russians are talking about cast iron legal guarantees. They're unlikely to accept this now, after all that has happened, as a cast iron legal guarantee. The NATO Council is supposed to publish a policy also saying that it accepts that Ukraine will not be a member of NATO. It might not be easy, by the way, to get all NATO states to agree a statement or resolution of that kind. Poland, the Baltic states, and the Scandinavian countries might object. Britain has just signed a 100-year agreement with Ukraine, which commits Britain to supporting Ukraine's aspiration to join NATO, and which makes clear that British policy is that Ukraine might also join NATO. That was, of course, the agreement that Starmer recently signed over the course of a trip he made to Kiev. The British, therefore, might also object to a NATO Council resolution reversing that and saying that Ukraine will remain a neutral country outside NATO. But even if the NATO Council overrides these objections and passes that resolution, given that Britain has entered into an international agreement with Ukraine, committing itself to seeing Ukraine one day in NATO, given that other NATO states no doubt also would continue to want to see Ukraine in NATO, given that the NATO bureaucracy, Mark Rutte, the previous NATO Secretary General, Stoltenberg, the various officials who work in NATO, probably are also committed to Ukraine joining NATO one day. How can one be sure that a NATO Council resolution saying that Ukraine would not join NATO would stick? Might it not also be reversed again? After all, at the end of the Cold War, the Russians were given categorical assurances by many senior NATO officials, by Prime Minister Major, by US Secretary of State James Baker, by the German Foreign Minister of the day. They all promised, the Russians at that time, that NATO would not move a millimetre east, not an inch east beyond eastern Germany. And there were many promises made. We now have a large amount of information. We've got transcripts and all kinds of things setting out and detailing those promises. It should be said that for many years, the fact that those promises were given were denied, including by many of the people who made them. But we now have them all set out in black and white. The archives have been sufficiently opened so that we can see the promises set out there in the transcripts, the records of the conversations that took place. And for the record, I remember the German Foreign Minister, Hans-Dietrich Genscher, making that very same promise on television. I remember watching him saying it in London at the time. Just saying. So, promises have been made not to extend NATO eastwards, and of course those promises were all taken back and NATO was expanded eastwards. So if NATO comes forward today and says that it is no longer intending to expand to include NATO, well, who's to say that tomorrow, under a different president in the United States and under different leadership in NATO, that promise too might not be reversed, and we might be back in the same position as we are in today, and with the whole conflict starting up all over again. Now, some will say that if all of these provisions are made, if after all that has happened, after the devastation of Ukraine, after the terrible war, and all of that, is most unlikely that a promise given this time not to extend NATO to Ukraine, that promise this time would be broken. But the Russians, who have been deceived many times by promises which have been broken, might take a different view. They might say that this really doesn't go anywhere near far enough. We have to insist on cast iron, legal guarantees set out in formal treaties. Mere promises, which is all that this would amount to, cannot be anywhere near enough. And what about the other provisions? Well, about the 4 regions, if the Ukrainians don't recognize the 4 regions as Russian, that might open up the day to renewed attempts by Ukraine to regain control of those 4 regions. Obviously, it would be foolhardy of Ukraine to try to do that, but Ukraine has done many foolhardy things over the last 30 years of its independence. So long as Ukraine doesn't recognize the 4 regions as Russian, or even a part of the 4 regions as Russian, the only guarantee the Russians would have that the Ukrainians might not one day march east and try to roll over and reoccupy the 4 regions again would be the Russian army. The Russian army, therefore, would have to maintain a permanent armed presence in the 4 regions. It would not be a stable, secure peace. It would be an armed peace, a very tense peace, very much like the one that exists in the Korean Peninsula. And that might not be what the Russians want. So the Russians might have issues with that too. And, well, with all of these provisions to unban parties, to hold elections, to allow the Russian language to be spoken again, to permit the Russian Orthodox Church to function normally. Well, once upon a time, Russian speakers in Ukraine, Orthodox Christians in Ukraine, had all those protections as well. And one day, or rather not just one day, but over time, policy in Ukraine shifted. All of these things changed. Laws were passed against use of the Russian language. The Russian Orthodox Church was disestablished. The Patriarchate of Constantinople, which is of course a Greek, not a Ukrainian institution, sided with the Ukrainian authorities over that. Who's to say, again, that might not happen all over again? After all, it happened before. Why should it not happen once more? You can enshrine all of these protections in the Ukrainian constitution. But just as with NATO membership, the constitution was changed before, and it can be changed again, and it can be changed further yet another time. And if we have a situation where the Ukrainians go back on all of these promises, as they went back on similar promises that they made in the 2015 Minsk agreement, for example, what are the Russians supposed to do? Are they supposed to restart the war because the Orthodox Church in Russia in Ukraine has been disestablished? What would the West say if something like that were to happen? Again, from a Russian point of view, this seems to fall far short of their minimal demands. And if we're talking about the position of Russian speakers in Ukraine, of the Orthodox Church in Ukraine. That brings us back to this vexed topic of denazification, which is, from a Russian point of view, I think perhaps more important than the West realizes. There is a narrative in the West which has gained a great deal of traction over the last few years, that the Russians aren't really serious about this, that this is all ultimately code for regime change in Kiev. There isn't any real problem in Ukraine. People of these ideologies, this kind of ideology, are not really present in Ukraine. Of course, if you read the Western media on a day-to-day basis, you would quite happily take the view that Ukraine is this perfect liberal democracy. There are hardly any people who hold these far out opinions in Ukraine. I read a long article in The Guardian just about 2 or 3 weeks ago discussing the Azov Brigade, which spoke about it in the most, laudatory terms, but which somehow managed completely to overlook the fact that it has, and that its members have, opinions, very, very hardline opinions. Again, I'm choosing my words very, very carefully, which, shall we say, bring it into complete alignment with the opinions that certain people had in Central Europe in the 1930s and 1940s. So people in the West, because they pretend that this problem does not exist, come forward and say, well, really, this isn't about this problem, because there isn't this problem. It's all just code for regime change. But for the Russians, I think it is quite different, because the Russians know perfectly well that whilst groups like Azov, Right Sector, Aidar, Svoboda in Western Ukraine exist, agitation to suppress the Russian language, to do away with the Russian Orthodox Church, to ban political parties that are friendly to Russia, all of that will continue. And it won't just be agitation. In February 2014, these parties and groups were instrumental in bringing about the Maidan events, the events which the Russians call a coup. Some of these people are heavily armed. They've now been militarized into brigade and organized into brigades. They've obtained military training and military experience. They form perhaps a fifth of the Ukrainian armed forces. If they continue to survive beyond the war, then they're obviously going to be activated in order to disrupt and defeat all of these moves to give Russian speakers and status to the Russian Orthodox Church, and any protections Russian speakers or the Orthodox Church are given in any agreement simply won't be worth the paper it is written on, just as the protections that were supposed to be provided ultimately through the Minsk Agreement of 2015 were never in fact realized. So again, an agreement that doesn't address this question of what the Russians call denazification is most unlikely to satisfy them. And then, of course, we come back to the key sticking point, which is this agreement insists that Ukraine must be allowed to maintain as big an army as it wants. And that, by the way, has been a demand made by President Zelensky itself. And the fact that this is apparently set out in this so-called plan, and that this plan supposedly also commits the United States to equipping this army. This is the major reason why I personally believe that this plan has a Ukrainian as opposed to an American provenance. Because this kind of provision, taken together with all of the others, this frankly nebulous proposal on NATO, nebulous from a Russian point of view, because they will say there's nothing really guaranteed about it. These proposals about rights for Russian citizens, none of this has any meaning unless, alongside denazification, the elimination of the political and institutional influence of these hard-right people in Ukraine. None of this is going to have any significance at all, while Ukraine also maintains powerful armed forces so that it can restart all its old plans all over again, seek NATO membership, ban pro-Russian political parties, close down the Russian church, take action against the Russian language, in the knowledge that there is this powerful military backed by the United States, able to deter the Russians from moving. The Russians will see this proposal, in effect, as a kind of elaborate reconstruction of the freeze proposal with a few irrelevant trimmings attached to it in order to make it more palatable and more acceptable to the Russians than it would otherwise be. Given that we are talking about very tough-minded people in Moscow, people who have lived through the conflict in Ukraine for the better part of a decade, well, for a decade now, and arguably even further, going all the way back to the Orange Revolution of 2004, it is scarcely conceivable that the Russians, from Putin down, will accept this as any kind of proposal, as any kind of endpoint to a negotiation. So, there it is. I think that this is a peace plan. I've gone into some late details to discuss why the Russians might object to it. It is a peace plan which looks to me to have a Ukrainian origin. And I wonder whether, in light of what Budanov has said, it originates from a group of people close to Budanov himself, perhaps either gathered around him, or perhaps an evolving faction in Kiev, which is starting to understand that Ukraine is going to lose the war, that its very survival as a state is now in jeopardy, and is trying to save the Ukrainian national project by basically tricking the Americans and the Russians into a peace agreement whose only real purpose, like the original Minsk agreement of 2015, is to buy Ukraine time. Just saying. But anyway, there are some other things about that Strana article, though, which were very interesting. And the article said that the American sponsors of this peace process are supposedly insisting that Zelensky rescind the decree that he published. Previous programs said that he published it in September 2022. The actual date, as it turns out, is 2nd October 2022. The decree which forbids Zelensky and anyone else in Ukraine from conducting negotiations with the Russians. I did a program recently in which I said how Zelensky is trying to obfuscate, gaslight people as to the language of his own decree. My colleague and friend, Alex Christoforou, has done a masterly comic piece on his channel about this very thing as well, by the way. But I said that just as Putin himself said over the course of the interview he gave to Pavel Zarubin over the weekend, that the very fact that Zelensky is coming up with these frankly untrue claims about the decree, it doesn't prohibit him from negotiating, it prohibits others from negotiating, and it doesn't really date from autumn 2022, as it actually does, but from the spring of 2022, when the Russians were outside Kiev. I suggested that the fact that Zelensky was coming up with these fairy tales about what is, after all, his own decree is a sign that he is indeed coming under mounting pressure, presumably from the Americans and from others, to scrap it. And, of course, Putin confirmed as much in his interview with Zarubin over the weekend as well. And unsurprisingly, the article in Strana tells us the same, that the Americans are demanding that this decree be scrapped so that negotiations can begin. And, well, I think this is probably the case. In fact, I have no doubt that this is the case. But I am going to suggest that it could also be the case that if there is a group in Ukraine that is trying to find some means to end the war in a way that would allow the Ukrainian national project, after a time, to be resumed, I'm wondering whether they, for their own reasons, might want to have this decree scrapped as well. Because Zelensky's own position is now deeply tied up with it. If Zelensky scraps the decree, if he rescinds it, then yes, he opens up the way for negotiations with the Russians. And that would be the overt purpose of scrapping the decree. It would mean, by the way, that he recognizes that President Putin is here to stay as president of Russia. The decree basically required Putin to step down, and that was to be the condition of the negotiations. So that would have been abandoned. But of course, if that happens, if Zelensky does that, and negotiations, serious negotiations, do begin, then might not that be the point in Ukraine when some people ask the question, is Zelensky, in that case, the right person to lead those negotiations. Of course, Putin himself says that he is not, because he is no longer the elected president of Ukraine. He is not the constitutional president of Ukraine because he has outlasted his term. Putin says that the Ukrainians need to regularize their position before he can seriously begin negotiating with them. They must either hold new elections or Zelensky can be sidetracked and the negotiations can be conducted through the Speaker of the Ukrainian Parliament, the Rada. That's Putin's position. But people in Ukraine might also at that point say that this is the moment when negotiations are beginning for Zelensky himself to go. Because Zelensky is massively damaged goods. He has presided for 3 years over a war that has gone disastrously for the Ukrainian people. Large areas of Ukrainian territory, or formerly Ukrainian territory, have been lost. Mariupol, once a key city, has been lost. Other places are being lost as well. Hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians probably have died in the war. The country is devastated. Is Zelensky any longer the right man to conduct negotiations, given that he is the person who authored this disaster? Is he, in fact, the person to continue to lead Ukraine if this decree is rescinded? After all, merely by act of rescinding this decree, Zelensky will himself, in effect, be admitting that passing the decree in the first place in October 2022 was a mistake because it required Vladimir Putin to step down, and that has proved unachievable, and Vladimir Putin is still in place. I am sure that any Ukrainians, including Budanov and who knows how many others, who do want to end the war within the next 6 months, are probably saying to themselves, Zelensky himself must go. He's not able to conduct negotiations on our behalf any longer. The Russians don't accept him. The Americans don't trust him. The Ukrainian people don't believe in him. He has himself admitted his huge error in passing this decree in the first place. It's time for him to go. And when this plan contains the provision that the decree must be rescinded, could it be that this is code for saying that the time has come for Zelensky himself to step down? Just saying. Anyway, these are very interesting times. An awful lot is clearly going on. It's going on under the surface in Kiev. It's going on in Washington as well. The Russians, in the meantime, watch and wait and see. Today, the Russians once again said that they've not actually so far had any substantive contacts from the Americans at all. That there's been no real sign yet that there is, in fact, any actual move being made by the United States to commence serious negotiations. Lavrov has been making comments to that effect, and other Russian officials have been making comments to that effect as well. Lavrov does not deny that, there might be scope for negotiations. Lavrov has had a meeting, for example, with, or rather not Lavrov, the Russian Deputy Foreign Minister, Mikhail Galuzin, had a meeting with Turkish ambassador to Moscow, Tansu Bilgits, and Galuzin spoke about potential negotiations. He said the sides, rather the Foreign Ministry said the sides held a substantive discussion on the situation in Ukraine. The Russian side emphasized the destructive role of Kiev and the West, holding them responsible for the further escalation of the conflict. Moscow reiterated its unwavering position on the unacceptability of Zelensky's peace plan. Well, I've discussed that to exhaustion in previous programs. And the Burgenstock process, that was the hopeless peace plan that we saw outlined in Switzerland a few months ago. Moscow pointed out to Ankara that countries aspiring to mediate the resolution of the Ukrainian crisis should adhere to the principle of neutrality and avoid aligning with any party to the conflict, which, by the way, on the face of it, excludes Turkey, because Turkey has, rhetorically speaking, sided with Ukraine over the course of this war. And the statement goes on to say, Moscow stated its openness to realistic peace initiatives and mediation proposals. In this regard, Russia noted the efforts of the Friends for Peace group, which is to say Brazil and China, favouring the peaceful settlement of the Ukrainian crisis. So there is talk about peace. There is an awful lot going on. The Russians are watching and waiting. They're undoubtedly going to be aware of this article in Strana. They've not yet received anything that remotely approximates to a plan from Trump and Rubio. There's not so far been any high-level contacts between the Russians and the Americans that we know about. In fact, we don't even know about any low-level contacts between the Americans and the Russians up to now. But anyway, all of this maneuvering, all of this goes on. The Russians watch and wait. They are aware, probably, that there is a fermenting crisis in Kiev. They're aware of Trump's and Rubio's stop order, which, by the way, extends, it actually has massive scope. I understand that it extends to funding of all the various NGOs, US government funding of all of the NGOs that are so busy around the world carrying out their various influencing operations in all kinds of places, Armenia, Georgia, Moldova, you name it, they're there doing it. Apparently they're all affected by it as well. It isn't just aid and funding that's going to Ukraine that's now been blocked. The Russians are aware of all of that too, and they're going to wait and see. And they're going to wait and see what Trump and Rubio and Kellogg come up with. But in the meantime, as they've also said, over the last 24 hours, they're going to press forward with the war. And the war continues, and it continues to follow the same pattern that it has followed for the last year and more, ever since basically the Ukrainian offensive of the summer of 2023 came to an end in October 2023, and the initiative passed to the Russian side. Now, today, the Russian Defense Ministry said that another village in Kursk region, Novosilka, located south of Duran, has been recaptured by the Russians. That is consistent with information we've had, that the Russians have now reached the boundaries of Sverdlikovo. So I'm not saying that the Ukrainian pocket in Kursk region is about to collapse, but the Russians are gradually tightening their vice there. There's been a lot more information from Chasiv Yar that the Russians have managed to capture significant more areas within Chasiv Yar itself. In Toretsk, there have been stories this morning, in fact a video this morning, which appears to show some Ukrainian vehicles moving around one of the coal mines which the Russians captured some time ago and taking Russian prisoners. And some people are saying that this proves that the Battle of Toretsk is far from over. I think, on the contrary, that this is clearly a desperate raid that the Ukrainians launched, perhaps to draw attention away from the catastrophe in Velyka Novosilka and to rob the Russians of the opportunity to make the announcement that two places, Toretsk and Velyka Novosilka, had fallen on the same day. I think that is probably all it was. A brief raid. The Ukrainians have done this previously. I've no doubt that all of this territory will rapidly fall back under Russian control again, and that the Ukrainians have simply suffered further losses to no useful purpose. And elsewhere, it seems that the Russians have continued to make further progress around Pokrovsk, but of course it is the disaster at Velyka Novosilka that continues to be the big story in Ukraine and of course in Russia. And now there's lots of pictures of Russian troops taking out their flags in Velyka Novosilka. The story that is spreading is that the actual fighting inside the town itself was relatively light, and that the Russians expect that when the moment comes for the attack on Pokrovsk, the fighting there will be relatively light also. Well, who knows? Anyway, that's the state of the war. Now, the Russians have just, of course, captured Velyka Novosilka. We don't know what they're going to do. I discussed in my program yesterday. My own view is that the next focus will be on Pokrovsk. They are close to cutting all the various communication lines to Pokrovsk, the road and railway arteries and that sort of thing. If Pokrovsk falls, well, it will completely overshadow the disaster that the defeat in Velyka Novosilka has previously been. And of course the Ukrainians have been making the usual attacks with their drones on Russia. Again, there continues to be heroic efforts made by various commentators in the West, especially, and in Ukraine, to argue that these raids, these drone attacks, are inflicting significant damage on the Russian economy, even though there is absolutely no statistical evidence whatsoever to support that claim, and accumulating evidence on the contrary, that only a small minority of the drones ever get through, and that the damage they do is relatively minor. The Russians, by contrast, continue to launch their drones and their missiles across Ukraine. This happens practically every night now. It's become so routine that it's been barely noticed, that it gets barely noticed. Of course, big missile strikes involving hundreds of missiles, they take place only 1 or 2 times a month, and we're some weeks from the last one, but that doesn't mean that we won't be getting further ones before long. the point is that the Russian war against Ukraine continues. The Ukrainians are still being ground down. And all of these maneuvers, these diplomatic intrigues, cannot change that outcome. Even Trump appeared to concede that when he spoke about Russia as this big machine. Maybe not the most attractive metaphor, but it is absolutely on points in the sense that the Ukrainians are taking on a force of men, machines, technology that they will never be able to match. And Budanov at least seems to understand this. Now, there have been two very interesting articles over the last 24 hours. One in the New York Times, one in El País. Both of these articles are basically telling us the same thing, that there is growing alarm in Europe that Trump and Putin are going to meet and come to decisions about Ukraine with each other, that they're going to settle the war between them, and that the Europeans and the Ukrainians are going to be frozen out. And this is apparently causing growing alarm in Europe. And to be frank, to say it simply, if this is indeed what is going to happen, if someone in Washington, perhaps Donald Trump himself, has come to the view that the only way to achieve progress in this matter is to cut out the Europeans and to cut out the Ukrainians, well, I have recommended that very thing myself in the past. Anatol Lieven did a piece a short time ago in Responsible Statecraft in which he said that at least the Ukrainians at the present time needed to be excluded. And the reason all of these people need to be excluded is the same reason, because they will come to these negotiations as spoilers. And interestingly, it's been suggested in these articles that the Russians and the Americans might actually, over the course of these negotiations, move beyond Ukraine. They might start talking about wider issues like nuclear weapons and possible reductions in nuclear weapon stocks, about all kinds of other things, about, dare I say it, new security arrangements for Europe, or as the Russians would say, Western Eurasia. Well, if all of that is true, then all I would say is it would be music to my ears. I think that would indeed be the best way to proceed. I am well aware of the fact that Europeans will be horrified at it. The British will be appalled. Ursula will be horrified. There's no knowing what Baerbock will say. But if Trump and his people are serious not just about peace in Ukraine, but about de-escalation of this terrible tension that we now have between the superpowers, I cannot think of a better way to move forward. Well, this is where I finish my program today. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop, links under this video. And last but not least, if you've liked this program, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this platform. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.